is such an empty conversation to be having.
Yeah.
This ruling has now made that idea more important than ever, is that I have to look like the traditional idea of a woman because I'm now going to get policed based on how I look before I get through the door.
That, I think, makes it even more concerning to me, the notion of the Passibility. It makes it really concerning to me.
Dylan Mulvaney, Caitlyn Jenner, Leah Thomas. Which of these moments do you think have been real turning points?
Western ideal of femininity. Big boobs, blonde hair.
Say my name, Jay. Say my name. Because I think we should protect the ones who biologically don't have a fucking chance.
Do you think that LGBTQ people have asked too much of people in terms of progressiveness too quickly?
We pushed her too far into what she is today.
I just think that it's an unhealthy topic.
Why should they give about what's happening right now?
Gay men face this exact language. We need all of you. We need you now because you will be next.
Hi, I'm Seana Mompson and I'm a brown trans girl that acts, models and content creates.
My name's Jake Graff and I am a filmmaker, author, actor and dad.
My name is Dani St. James. I am chief exec of Not a Phase, which is a leading charity supporting trans adults across the UK.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for coming. I know that the past couple of weeks have been a lot, and I know that you would have been asked and requested to appear and talk on many different platforms and, you know, appear on different things. So thank you for being here today. I want to say why this podcast is having this conversation. This podcast is primarily listened to by gay men. And from what I've heard, trans people say that gay men aren't always there for them. Now, my first question is, would you agree?
Yes.
I mean, I lived as a lesbian for about 15 years, and I have to say that at the time I felt when I transitioned, a lot of the lesbians I knew were very angry with me and felt I kind of betrayed them. And I do hear that a lot from trans women, that a lot of the gay men they used to know sort of feel similarly, like, why couldn't you just be a part of the community? Why couldn't you just sort of find your place within the community? Why did you have to move away and kind of, you know, become a woman? So I would imagine that that's probably why there is a feeling amongst some gay men and some lesbians that they're not entirely trans supportive.
Right. How about you, Seana?
I think for me, I haven't really necessarily noticed any of that like in my day-to-day life because either people don't know I'm trans or my circle that's now like across like different cities, they're all just like my allies and friends who are part of the queer community. But recently, since I like started threading, I noticed a lot of gay people saying LGB without the TQIA, and I'm just like, but if you're oppressed, like how are you like supporting oppression? I can't fathom that, to be honest.
There seems to be, I mean, it's widely known there is this group, LGB Alliance.
Bad people.
The idea that gay and lesbian people aren't there enough for trans people, the thought could be that gay people have their rights. We are living lives now which are pretty, you know, undisrupted, and we kind of can do everything that most people can do. So therefore we think, oh, you know what, we're good, and that's kind of it. Would you agree with that sentiment, or do you think that gay and lesbian people are very much still concerned about trans rights and always there with you?
I do think it's important not to generalise, because, you know, when we sort of talk about all the lesbians and all the gay men, of course there are women that, I mean, there, you know, we know that there are trans exclusionary lesbians who just really don't like trans people and don't feel that trans women belong in their spaces. And I'm sure that there are gay men that feel similarly, but by the same token, you know, I've had such an outpouring of support for the last couple of weeks from a lot of our gay friends who said, you know, we're with you, we're fighting the good fight, we're all in this together. But, you know, I also really struggle to understand how anyone who knows how it feels to grow up feeling othered, to feel different, to feel like you're sort of excluded from society and you might be a disappointment or to have to come out, for any of those people to kind of, you know, deride trans people, to me seems really bizarre. But we do see it, you know, because obviously there will be people that disagree, you know, throughout life, whether you're gay, lesbian, trans or straight.
I think what you said, that there's a lot of accuracy to it, and it's, as Jake said, it's not to generalize gay. I think gay men, especially when we're talking about this topic, it's important to say that for our sort of like wider LGBT movement, the people that have benefited from it the most are gay men. And for, if you use the workplace as an example, for many companies, they would see the diversity of their team mainly riding on a couple of gay guys. And that diversity is kind of closed door to the rest of the community, especially people that live out loud. And so I think if they don't acknowledge the privilege that they have gotten from the movement and recognise that they've kind of like taken every step of the ladder and then pulled it behind them, then that's where the problem lies. It's definitely not to sort of like judge all gay men. I think that gay men are like the biggest love of my life and always have been. But there's also a problematic culture of forgetting that we need them to use their voices, which are for the most part the loudest.
Okay, it was interesting because your answers were slightly different, but it still does kind of touch on that there isn't this whole sense of togetherness, which I think is required.
I think, what is important to remember is that we all have our struggles. We're all, either dealing with kids or furry kids or, sick parents or, breakups or makeups, or everyone's got their worries. We know that the economy's soaring. We know we're all struggling with mortgage. We know to then sort of look out at the world and think, I should be thinking about what's going on with the trans people and the disabled people and the people of colour and I think if you're in your little bubble and all is well, then you'll probably think to yourself, thank God for that, and just getting on with it. And I totally understand that, because my God, the world is a difficult place. But I think within our community, we have to realise, look at what's going on in the US. I'm sure a lot of these gay men that voted Trump in weren't thinking at the time, once they've done the trans people and the non-binary people and then probably attack the lesbians, they're going to come for me and my gay marriage that I fought so hard for. But as we know, if you start with the lowest minority, which is obviously the trans community, poor us, it then does work its way back and it will eventually start nipping at the tails of the white cisgender gay men.
So if we were to just outline what was the Supreme Court ruling, the 15th of April 2025, the UK Supreme Court ruling clarified that in the Equality Act 2010, woman and sex refer to biological sex, not gender identity. How this might affect day-to-day life, I mean, you'll tell me, but on paper, this means that you're limited to certain access in spaces, and very importantly, it kind of signals a cultural shift in the country. It's not just that this has been stated in law, but it almost sets a precedent for what the UK thinks about trans people. Would you
Correct.
agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think that's really important to state, is that this is, in my view, is essentially the first domino. And what comes next, as we hear the murmurs from, like the Justice Secretary and the Minister for Health, we know that this will start to enact policy change across the board and enable and embolden hatred of trans people even further. It hands over, if a private business had previously said, like, trans women are not going in the women's bathrooms, then the Equalities Act would have prevented them from enforcing that. However, now it gives everyone the ability to sort of like take their own stance, whether they support us or not. Which opens up a huge grey area for the way that trans people are treated across the board. And then if you look towards more like public services, we're talking about prison reform, we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about end of life care. We're talking, the list goes on of how this will affect day-to-day life of trans people across this country.
The carelessness and recklessness of like first putting out like these headlines of like calling trans women men and all of that is like so damaging in of itself, even if like it's not made into an actual law yet. Because there's people like that are grey about like, oh, trans people, but like they see these headlines and then that will sway them to the other side. And then there's those people that are really like, it's like they wake up every day just to like get at trans people or anyone different. So it just further promotes people to be like, I know you, I think you're trans, and then you're not allowed in here. Just like all this attention on someone that may or may not be trans. From the conversations I've had, I'm just like, I think it's going to happen. It's going to be made compulsory for however long it lasts.
And what's interesting is that there's been no mention of trans men in this.
Well, that's not absolutely true. I mean, for the first time, weirdly, trans men have been mentioned, because the first argument that people went back with, well, if trans women aren't supposed to be in women's spaces, then obviously trans men are. And so for me, the law that came out, the guidance that came out straight away was that obviously I'm a biological female and therefore I must be in a women's bathroom. So then they have updated that guidance since and said that because I am so far down my transition that obviously appear like a cisgender guy, that I'm now also, if anyone objects, not allowed to use a women's toilet. So that means that I'm kind of floating now. I'm not really allowed to use either. Normally, and more often than not, there is not a third space. I would feel really awkward using a disabled toilet. I think the only time I would use one if I was out, I've got two little daughters, a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and when they need daddy to take them to the loo and mummy's not there, where am I supposed to take them now? I would always have just taken them into the men's room and kind of, you get on with it. It's all a bit gross. You tell them not to touch anything. They touch everything. But, you get in, you get out. But now I can't take them in there according to this guidance.
Right.
And if it's made into law, particularly as, I am recognisable, what if someone drags me out? What if someone says something in front of my kids? I mean, I think that's probably less likely to happen in a men's space. But it could happen, and I don't know how. I mean, none of this is enforceable realistically, because if this goes through, there will be weird, it will almost like citizens' arrests, because they haven't got enough bobbies to walk on the beat down the road and protect old ladies. They certainly don't have enough police people to police the toilets. So this thing is just unenforceable, and you're going to get a lot of sort of vigilante justice, which already happens now. We've seen reports in the media of women who've had chemotherapy being dragged out and challenged because they're bald. We've seen reports of broader women, taller women being dragged out, butch lesbians. The list goes on. This is going to affect cisgender women much more than it will trans women, because trans women are a much smaller group anyway. But for me as a trans guy, for the first time, we have to be targeted by this guidance, because otherwise it will seem very much like it's just for the trans women. But they don't really know what to do with people like me, because obviously, according to them, I can't be in the men's, but I clearly don't belong in the women's.
I think it sparks from the statistics of like biological cis-het men doing the most offences, like being a predator, being a rapist and all of that. And then because people see us trans women as men, they're like, so that person is going to target my children, target me, blah, de, blah, de, blah. So that's why it's always at the forefront.
I spend a lot of my work life going into like workplaces and stuff like that, talking about these issues. And I always say, I believe that 95% of the UK are fence sitters. I think that we are just a country of people, for the most part, who want the best for everyone, as long as it actually just has nothing to do with me. As long as your life doesn't stop me from watching Coronation Street or going on holiday, I don't care. So, but it's the language that changes that. And so, when the media, especially the right-wing media, is emboldened to use language like male-bodied rapist, that changes people's fence-sitting and it scares people. So do you want a male-bodied penis haver on the hospital ring next door to your nan? Of course you don't. And that scares people. Of course I don't want these scary people. The reality is we're talking about this like tiny faction of the country that face the same levels of oppression as cis women and face the same scrutiny and the same misogyny. But it's the language around it that changes people's perception. And that's why the fear tactic, all of a sudden you've got people saying, well, yeah, it's supposed to happen. They are men. They would never have said that before. I transitioned 15 years ago and there was no language like this. There was nothing like this 15 years ago. It's changed. It's changed because the target has moved and the target's changed to us. And it's, you know, look, I hate to beat a dead horse with this one, but the language that's being used about us now was used on you on what, 15, 20 years ago. Gay men face this exact language of being groomers, of being rapists, of
Pedos.
being hiding,
Yeah.
pedos, hiding in the bathrooms.
Yep.
You know, they're going to brick your windows, kill your cat, and steal your kids. It's
those things.
exactly the same language. It's just the target's moved on to us. You're right, it's more so trans women because it's that fear around men. Men are the thing to be scared of.
Yep.
Whenever I'm online doing my little thing, a lot of people, especially because of what's just happened, but a lot of people are talking to me about cases of like supposedly trans women doing these horrendous acts on like children and stuff like that, convicted like felons and stuff like that. But I always say, like, what has that got to do with me? One or a couple or whoever's actions shouldn't demonize an entire community of people, because you see it with like racism. People are, especially in the US of A, like people are scared of black children, and it's the same discrimination. It's just that weird, deep-rooted fear of someone because of somebody else's action, and then that you're automatically capable of doing that. I just don't care for that because that's not me, and it's just ridiculous.
You know, we as a society should not judge groups by their worst possible tiny minority.
Absolutely.
And, you know, the whole, because it does go back to toilets. You know, when they started talking about trans women in hospital wards and so on, women's hospital wards, probably about a year ago, and that's when it really started getting pushed into the media. They literally went around all the NHS hubs and asked if there'd been any problems with any trans women on any hospital wards at any point, and there were not a single complaint or issue raised anywhere. And yet that was then front page of all the newspapers, you know, these predatory women. For God's sake, they're lying in bed trying to recover from, you know, the same thing as anyone else is trying to recover from. And then it all comes back, you know, it all starts with the toilets. And just as if you go back 100 years, 150 years, you know, there were white women cowering in a corner who didn't want black women and women of colour coming into their spaces, not for any other reason that it offended their white privilege and feeling that it needed to be their space. We know that these women weren't doing it, these women of colour were not doing anything, but that was the sort of argument that we don't want these people in our spaces. And thank God that was rolled over. And then it was obviously gay men in the 80s and 90s, you know, kind of at the urinal next to you, peering in and doing God knows what else, and then not you, obviously, and then, you know, we're here, and it's trans women. I mean, my wife is trans, and I know that she walks into a toilet, and when she's with the girls, she keeps her voice down because she's got a very deep voice, because she is so worried about someone challenging her in front of our little daughters. When she's in a changing room, she said, I keep my head to the wall, I barely look, I'm so scared of someone thinking I shouldn't be there or challenging me. She lives in fear. And I know that a lot of the trans women, not all of us, but a lot of trans women that I know spend their lives and their existences worrying and in fear. They are not the predatory ones. They are the ones who are honestly the most maligned, beaten, attacked and murdered tiny subsection of the entire LGBTQIA community.
And what you were describing then about your wife going into a changing room, that isn't a new thing. That isn't since the 15th of April.
No,
this has been for years and years.
For years and years, because, you know, she came out when she was serving in the military. You know, she did 10 years as an officer in the British Army, came out halfway through and actually got great support from the British military, went on to change policy, have non-binary people included for the first time in military policy, did great things, and was so accepted by this sort of super masculine macho institution. And yet in daily life, the papers, the roar of transphobia was already kind of rearing its ugly head. And that has only picked up in pace over the last decade, since there was the first talk of reviewing the Equalities Act. And the papers just, you know, the media, the press just went full throttle. I mean, you know, there was one year where I think the Sunday Times had 330 anti-trans articles. You know, there's been this torrent of abuse. And obviously, you know, as Dani said, when she first transitioned, you didn't see it anywhere. But now think of the kids, the trans kids walking to school every morning, seeing it on the newsstands, seeing it on the news, the constant hate. Of course it's going to make women like my wife nervous about going into the toilet. You know, she'd be mad not to feel that.
Trans people are like one of the first to always be hyper aware of how they're perceived, because that a lot of typically goes so much into like transitioning. So they're the first to always like think about like, oh my God, is somebody gonna like try and out me, blah blah blah, like how am I gonna like survive in day-to-day life? So that anxiety for the average trans person doesn't necessarily go away, and with this what's just happened, it just amplifies it. I don't think people understand like the steps that it takes to actually transition, because you get psychoanalysis, you get so many things, at least with the NHS, you have to like do your due diligence, live as your affirmed gender for a while. You don't happen to like change overnight. Yeah, it can be like something that goes on for quite a while and then you decide that you want to begin the process, but there is a process to be transgender, especially in the legal system. So it frustrates me to the nth degree when people are like, you're a cross-dresser, because that's not what trans is.
What I've had on my Instagram the last couple of days, because I was on television on Monday on Lorraine, because she's amazing and such a huge ally. And since then, it has just been a barrage. I mean, again, these people all arguing with each other. It's great when the allies sort of want to go to bat for you, but it just means that your Instagram keeps pinging up with endless hate, because there will always be trolls that want to argue with everything about being trans. And there are people saying, you know, lots of sort of, you know, pity our poor children. Well, our children are actually very happy. Thank you very much. But there's also lots of, you know, that's clearly a man and that's clearly a woman. Obviously, my wife's the man and I'm the woman. And, you know, they're mentally ill and this is, you know, just be glad of the way you're born and, you know, you've messed with nature and you get everything you deserve. And there is very, very little understanding, I think, of what it is to be trans, again, because it doesn't affect, I think 89% of people haven't knowingly met anyone transgender. So unless you've got a trans friend or a brother or a mother or a father or a kid, or you're unlikely to sort of understand that community. But, you know, for us, this is not something that we have chosen, because it's a bloody hard life and I don't think anyone would choose it. It is something that, you know, as Shauna said, sorry, it's something that we have struggled with. I struggled with it for years. I knew when I was about 3 years old that I was a boy, and, you know, grew up under Section 28 and fought for years to be seen and recognised and accepted by my family. You know, we go through so much. We go through so much othering and feeling of, you know, being ostracised by society. No one would choose this. This isn't some sort of weird thing that all these trans women have chosen just to be able to loiter in a women's toilet. Because, you know, as we all know, if a man wants to be predatory, he's not going to go through the steps of transition. You know, he will just meet a woman in a bar and do awful things, or meet a woman in the street and do awful things, or do any number of things that, you know, a predatory man would want to do. To kind of lump in trans women and predatory men makes no sense. It is purely bigotry and hatred, and illogical at best.
So to your point on what you said about the comments that you get, and I'm sure all of you have received comments off the public just saying dumb, hurtful things. What is it, do you think, about being trans that offends so many people? What is it about it? Because obviously you could say that if there was gay hate, there's a religious backing to it, you know, it's man should be with women, that sort of thing. But what is it about being trans that you think that just disrupts people so much?
I think a lot of people don't, you know, we're all brought up believing that it's girls and boys and pink and blue and you belong there and you belong here. I think there's a lot of that we sort of disrupt a little bit, and I think people don't get it. And I think with trans women, this is my wife's theory, with trans women there's always a suspicion, because masculinity is obviously far superior to femininity, as we all know. Why would anyone want to drop down from that position of privilege and power and become, as we know, not even have the sort of privilege of a woman, but a trans woman, which is, you know, possibly like the lowest demographic in terms of respect and safety and everything else. I think there is a suspicion and there's a wariness and there's a why would you do that? Whereas for me, I get told that I'm just, you know, a confused woman or a lesbian sort of who's gone off the rails, or, you know, so I think there's an understanding that for me, of course a woman would want to be more masculine, because that just makes sense, because we all know that masculinity is best. So I think that's what it is. There's this real sort of suspicion as to why anyone would kind of embrace it were it not for nefarious activity.
I think I see the common things I see, which does kind of go in hand with like religion, is that for trans women, the thing that's always brought up is like, it's not natural, you can't conceive, blah, 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 and stuff like that. And you have to pump through like artificial hormones through your body just to replicate and imitate. So it's just always seen as like a science project. Like it's like not natural, basically. And that goes for trans men as well.
What do you think, Dani?
Yeah, I do. I agree. I think that there's an air of it where they think that there's some sort of deception, that we're trying to deceive them into that we are something that we're not. I don't speak for all trans women because I know that a lot feel differently to me. But I actually didn't want to be a cis woman. I don't give a shit about being perceived as one either. I think that there's something really, really powerful in being seen to have said, I actively choose to be who I am, and every single part of me that you see was something that wasn't only decided upon, but it was something that was worked for. You know, I've reached my mid-30s and every single part of my life was something that I had to really work my arse off for. And so I think that there's an illusion and a misunderstanding that we're trying to be seen as something that we're not. But that changes when you embrace the fact that you're really fucking proud of it.
So we were talking about earlier, I suppose, you said that this will affect cisgender people as well, because this is about the way people look, and people now we've almost given people, they have given people permission to stop and check people's sex at the door, as it were. So this idea of passing has become more important than ever, you could say. Do you think that's correct?
Yeah, I think passibility is a completely subjective thing anyway, and I think for the most part it's an insidious topic in our community. I think it's just an absolute illusion, because look, for what is possible for one person is completely clockable for the next. I've got trans friends, and I'm like, I cannot see a single thing about you that anybody could notice that you were trans. And then like one of my friends or my family will say like, oh, she's trans, right? Or whatever it is, you know, like. So it's completely subjective, and I think it's a really unhealthy thing within our community. And a lot of the trans women that I can see sort of speaking on this topic are like as a passable trans woman, I have to say, and it's like, well, passable to who? Because maybe you're not to me, or maybe you're not to Jake or whoever. You know, I just think that it's an unhealthy topic, and it also really ties back to what are you trying to pass as? Why are you not trying to be just like present as who you are? I'm not trying to pass as anything that I'm not. I'm trying to show up as who I am. And so passibility is a complete illusion, I think.
I've been attacked my whole life for being a cis-passing guy, which is so weird because, you know, I transition, obviously testosterone is an incredibly strong and powerful hormone. And so, you know, those changes that happen, like the beard and the sort of deepening of voice and broadening of muscle and all, you know, whatever those physical changes are. But I have been knocked a lot of my life for sort of, you know, being cis passing when I just am happy to look as I look, and, you know, always wanted a beard and was quite chubby. I was shaving my face with my dad's razor when I was 4 years old. But I know that there is a real kind of, as Dani said, a real sort of anger, spite, bitterness, willingness to kind of attack people if they pass, which obviously shouldn't be the case, or if they are deemed to pass, it shouldn't be the case. But I think in terms of this ruling, again, every time you sort of like try to think about it logically, it just doesn't make sense, because obviously there are lots of trans people who, even these women, you know, with their eagle eyes and who can apparently tell absolutely because, you know, whatever, who would not know, who could be standing at the sink, you know, next to Seana and think, you know, we got those horrible trans people out, and not have a clue. And yet then behind them, a slightly butcher woman could walk in with shorter hair, and all of a sudden it's a trans person in here. So it's not enforceable, it's not tenable, it's not viable, it's not logical, it's not reasonable, the whole thing is just so, you know, I don't want to sort of talk badly about the legal system, but it's so stupid. It is, you know, scientifically illegitimate. It's you know, illiterate. It's biologically nonsensical. It makes no sense. And how are we possibly going to enforce this? Because we, you know, there are so many, you know, unless you fall into what I guess these people are thinking is the Western ideal of femininity, which is what? I mean, big boobs, blonde hair. Sorry,
Say my name, Jake. Say my name.
I don't even know what that is, what that looks like.
It's Eurocentric.
Because we are, yeah. Because we are scamdy. Because we are so broad in our, you know, I know I've got male friends who are cis males who look way less male than me, and I've got, and vice versa, and it's just not enforceable. And of course, because there are many more cisgender people out there, it's obviously going to affect them more adversely statistically than it will us.
Dani, I know that the passing conversation for you, you've said that it's something that it's not even worthy of time and discussion.
Sure.
That's correct, right?
Sure, yeah. Look, yeah, I do. Look, like I say, I feel like a bit of like an elder in this space. And listen, I remember when I think about myself when I was 17, right? I look back at photos of myself now and objectively, gay boy with a bob. That's where I was at. Like visually, say what you see, gay boy with hair like this. You could not tell me anything. I thought that I was like Anna Nicole Smith at that time, right? And and so that's why I say it's completely subjective. And I remember being like, yes, my hair's my own, because I thought I had one up on the girls in the wigs, because I was like, my hair's my own. It's completely subjective, and it changes with time. And like Jake said, the system, especially in the UK, completely based on Eurocentric ideals of like blonde hair, blue eyes, big boobs. But it's a broken system that doesn't work. So that's why I just get so like, oh, just shut up about Passibility. And when I see other trans people platforming it and saying like, oh well, see you at the urinal, you know, like I'm like it's just like not helpful. Let's just like work towards the next thing, get past it. 'Cause I'm like, it doesn't mean anything. It's
Yeah, I think it is a toxic mindset to have. And one of the reasons why, and I was talking about it earlier, one of the reasons why I do what I do is because, like, for the majority of the stuff, especially online, nobody would know that I'm trans had I not disclosed it. Because a lot of people are saying, like, what trans girl, what does that mean? And then I'm like, I'm trans. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I couldn't tell, blah, de, blah, 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 blah. Everyone's perception is through their lens. Like womanhood to me does mean the physical attributes, but that's not all of it. But how much time do I have to explain my whole life story? Not a lot.
So if we were to think that the term passing does hold meaning for some trans people, let's just like say that might be the case.
To a lot of them, it definitely is the case.
So-
Absolutely 100%.
So with that thought, do you think that this ruling has now made that idea more important than ever? Is that I have to look like the traditional idea of a woman?
No, it's enforcing
because
it.
I'm now going to get policed based on how I look before I get through the door.
But that I think makes it even more concerning to me, the notion of the Passibility. It makes it really concerning to me because I know how restrictive attaining those beauty standards is, and also the sort of like socio-economic system prevents trans people from reaching that level. You know, we're talking about like, you know, if you want to go really traditional, in speaking specifically about trans women, we're talking multiple surgeries, each being upwards 5k, 10k, 15k. How do they get that money? Does the system allow them to earn that money, or is the system rigged against them from the beginning? So we're talking about like reinforcing something that is completely unobtainable to the vast majority of the community that it is restricting. It's just like such a broken system, you know. Like I said, a lot of my work life is spent going into workplaces and talking about like, how do we open your door so the diversity can flow in, because it is going to enrich your workplace. But the reality is trans people are not working in most workplaces. They are restricted to very few industries, and a lot of the time marginalised into careers that they probably wouldn't have chosen. So it's a really multi-layered conversation about Passibility and what it takes to get to these like ridiculous standards that most will never hit. So that's why it just makes me so fucking angry.
But do you mind me talking about this?
Talk about it.
So the
Speak up.
The pressure of Passibility.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's being enhanced by cisgender people, or is it an internal feeling with the trans person themselves? Do you think that trans people wouldn't care as much to pass if there wasn't this societal
I
expectation.
think very much society pushes us to have to fit in and be man enough or woman enough. Even from the sort of very beginning, we are trying to convince our therapists or us, whoever we're seeing, that we have gender dysphoria by being as, yes, I've lived in role for 2 years, and yes, I wear the right clothes, and yes, because that every single barrier, every gatekeeper needs to feel that you are trans enough.
Yeah.
So obviously, when you go and see these people, it's, and how are you living and what do you do? And I remember when I went to get my first kind of, sign off from the doctor that I had gender dysphoria was, what sort of sports do you play? And are most of your friends male? And I mean, this was way back.
Yeah.
And these were normal questions. And then obviously the next step for me, which I did, was the GRC, the Gender Recognition Certificate, where again, you're being tested on your gender. It's like literally a test of, do you like pink or blue? It's just ridiculous. So throughout, it is just something that is put upon trans people. Are you trans enough? In my case, are you man enough? In your case, are you woman enough? And that is very, as well as the internalized transphobia that we all sort of try to push away because that's ingrained in us from when we're tiny children. It's also that sort of feeling of, am I enough? And of course, with that comes, do I pass enough? When I go into a men's toilet, and last week after this had happened, I walked into a toilet, I thought, I actually shouldn't be here anymore. But then, I look around and no one's looking at me because men don't look at each other anyway in toilets, unless you're in a certain kind of... and I just kind of went about and came out, and that was absolutely fine. But I know that there are a lot of my trans male friends now who are freaking out because they don't have a beard, because they're not tall enough, because they're not broad enough, because they're not deep voiced enough, because they don't stand and wee, and these people are terrified because they know that they'll get dragged out of a women's toilet, but they now feel that they don't pass enough to be in a men's toilet. So this of course, this has caused and will continue to cause immense problems. And so I think for the lucky trans people that do pass, who can probably still go about their lives without hindrance, it's a better position to be in, which should not be the case, but it is.
I think that's what we should start we should stop reinforcing the behaviour of the ones that have supposed passability and stop validating it. I also I love the sort of ethos of the movement and how much money it's raised for a really worthy cause. But that's also why I think that Protect the Dolls is a completely defunct line. I think we should be protecting the ones that are not possible. I don't think we should be protecting the dolls. I think we should be protecting the bricks. I think we should be protecting the ones that are visible.
Are we calling them bricks? Is that what they're called?
Probably should.
Have you just called
said CEO
all
of trans
trans women?
No, I think we should be I think we should be protecting the early days. I think we should protect the ones that transition when they're in their 60s. I think we should protect the ones who biologically don't have a fucking chance. I think we should be protecting them first.
To hone in on your question though about passability as a whole, I think it's always had a place within the trans community because people, like I said, are hyper aware of how they're perceived. But definitely there was an air of people, especially with the TikTok content creators of today, of making that a mimic of I pass so well because they have an air about them and to get views, as everyone does. So I think that is at play, but then it's further heightened through all of this that's just happened because it's everybody's issue now. It was a part of the trans community, but it's going to affect everyone to pass. That's even cisgender.
Well, it's absolutely well said that it is absolutely going to mean these cis women who are now sort of potentially a bit more masculine, a bit more how many times I've got friends, lesbian friends who are. Every time they go into a toilet, pretty much, they get, excuse me, sir, you shouldn't be in here. Security banging on doors and trying to get them out. And, for them, they're already kind of going, Christ, it's just going to get worse.
Yeah.
It's going to get worse for them. We've got another friend who's, gone through a battle with cancer recently, who has got short hair and who's got slightly fluffy cheeks at the moment, who's also saying, it's going to affect me because I'm going to get people coming to attack me in toilets and question me and challenge me and all the things that just really, when you're going for a wee, you just don't want to happen. But unfortunately, there will be those people, as Dani said earlier, that are emboldened now to go in and challenge. Well, the law says so, the HRC says so, the Supreme, so I'm going to go and have a bloody go because I'm that unhappy with my own life that I'd like to go and attack someone pointlessly in a public toilet.
what do you think has shifted in terms of the media and public perception of trans people? So being trans today versus being trans 5, 8 years ago, have you noticed, for those who transitioned at that period, have you noticed a difference in terms of public perception and just general reaction to trans people?
I think it's 10 years now when they announced, in fact, maybe 8, when they announced they were reviewing the Equalities Act. And this is what kicked this off, because just before that, there was a doctor called Kate Gladstone who had been gored by a bull.
Huh?
And in the British media, everyone in the British media, all the newspapers reported this as transgender doctor gored by bull. And this outed her, and it caused her all these... And as she lay in her hospital bed, on the verge of death, all the media was kind of like, we shouldn't really have outed this doctor and called her trans doctor, because that wasn't the relevant part of the story. The relevant part of the story was that this poor woman had been gored by this bull. And there was a sort of flip within the media, and I was at the time quite involved with Trans Media Watch, and they sort of pushed this through, that this should never have happened to this trans doctor, to this doctor. And the media sort of for a little moment flipped, and we were starting to see positive trans stories. There was the film The Danish Girl, which I know a lot of people have got issue with, but was a really positive trans story that went out there, that helped a lot of people. It's one of Hannah's favourite films. I know people don't agree Eddie should have played that role, but the media was sort of being kind. There were trans people popping up in EastEnders. There were trans people kind of, popping up in the media, and it was positive, weirdly. Nadia had won Big Brother, and people, there were some negative things, Portuguese or etc., but largely people really celebrated this trans woman coming out and being there. So there was a kind of blip of maybe 5 years where, when I met Hannah, when she'd just come out in the military, she was given an MBE by Prince William for her work in the military. And it sort of felt like things were kind of okay. And I think we all relaxed.
Yeah.
And it just, when they announced that they were reviewing the Equalities Act, it just went to hell. And these women, who are probably some of the same women that were banging their drum outside the Supreme Court a few weeks ago, are the ones who sort of said, right, this is our chance, this is our opportunity, we are going to get in there. And it just sort of gained momentum, and the media realised that trans people are great clickbait, and that people are fascinated with trans people. And that was it. That happened over about a year, and then they realised, these people are selling papers and getting clicks, and the more anti-trans rhetoric you put out there, the more powerful. And the last 8 years have been
rough.
To say vitriolic, to say toxic, to say dangerous, all of those things. And this is why we are where we are today. And whilst these people in the media and the governments, both governments, were busy kind of behind the scenes whipping up, and not even just, very vocally whipping up this hate, our community has sort of floundered, not quite known. Because bear in mind, our community has very little to link us all together. We're not, we're not from the same race, caste, class, colour, sexuality. We don't even have sexuality to link us all together. Because obviously trans people, are straight, are gay, are queer. So our community doesn't really have anything to draw us together. Whilst these women do, they've got the hatred of us.
If we were to identify moments in the media and sort of pivotal turning points that have led to where we are today. So to give you some examples that may have riled people up. So Dave Chappelle's comedy, Dylan Mulvaney, Caitlyn Jenner, Leah Thomas, Trump's entire campaign, Isla Bryson. Which of these moments do you think have been real turning points?
I do think that it was the Caitlyn Jenner turning point. That was a real benchmark of time, I think. What is that, 8 years ago? Something like that.
Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine.
I think it was the same year.
Absolutely right.
I think that was a real tipping point. And I do think, though, that there was positive and negative that came out of that. Because, when I transitioned, I was 17, and it was a few months after I had started sneaking into gay clubs when I was like 16, 17. And I met these trans women that used to work down the mines, and they used to stand at the back of the gay clubs. And as soon as I met them, obviously had nothing in common with them, but it was like, oh my God, I totally understand who I am now. Like, I just thought that I was a really shit gay boy my whole life. I was like, I know that I like men, but the rest of it makes no fucking sense to me. And then as soon as I met these old trans women, I was like, oh, I totally get it now. And then I think what happened is, when people like Caitlyn Jenner and Laverne Cox and Nadia Almeida and all of them came into people's living rooms, all of a sudden some people had the ability to go, oh my God, that's who I've been the whole time. And that was why there was there's such a misconception about like grooming or radicalizing young people. And it's not. It's just the case that people now have the opportunity to go, oh my God,
That's
I
me.
totally get it now, because there's representation that comes in all different forms. We now have this like access to knowledge and shared experience that we never had before. But with that also came the Caitlyn Jenner period, came a completely new understanding that trans people are actually everywhere. Like we have always been here and we are everywhere. Whereas, you know, I revert back to my story of me just looking like a clocky gay boy with a bob. Back then, this is 2009, 2009, I can't remember the exact timings of it. Back then, long hair, makeup and nail polish meant you were she. No matter where you went, you were she. Whereas now, completely different, because people's understanding of trans people has completely changed, and not only their understanding but their judgment of trans people has completely changed. And now people are like feel like they have this this need to be eagle-eyed and looking for these evil characteristics that we walk among them.
And in terms of a negative shift,
Yes, that's what I mean. Like they've now.
what was a real pivotal moment for you? I know that you said Caitlyn Jenner, but that almost sounded like
No,
it
that was
had.
more
That was
positive.
positive.
Yeah,
That was positive.
Yeah,
so in terms of these sort of news stories that I mentioned, which one kind of started the decline of public perception?
I think the government change. Sorry, I know you were going to say something.
No,
there.
no, I was no.
I think that if we're specifically talking about this country, I think that there's a similar timeline again to revert back to the gay men conversation of the Tories in the 80s running out of things to run on, so they ran on the hatred of gay men. I think the Tories ran out of fucking options, so all of a sudden they turned on trans people, and I think that happened about 5 years ago, and then all of a sudden we started being addressed and we started being spoken about, and all of a sudden it was like the call was coming from inside the house and the problem was us. And since that point we have become political fodder in this country, and it reverberates from the US. So I would say like the negative side of things not only has infiltrated the media, but the media has been emboldened by our political system.
Yeah, and there was actually Hannah a couple of years ago found an article in the New York Times about a few years ago there was a think tank as part of the kind of the right wing, the evangelicals in the US, where they knew they'd lost gay marriage and they needed something else to kind of, you know, rally the troops and really kind of, you know, get them all moving again. And they threw lots of things at the wall, and what stuck was trans people, but more specifically trans kids, which is why that then has become such a big thing in the US. As you say, everything that happens over there leaks over here.
Yeah.
And that, I think, there were lots of different things. And, you know, yes, there was probably one trans person who did one bad thing and obviously ended up all over the cover of all the newspapers, even though that is a society not how we should be judging any minority group. And I think that was just it. And then, you know, Caitlyn Jenner, who had this great amount of support, you know, coming out, cover of Vanity Fair, and it was all so positive and so wonderful, and so then revealed herself to be just not good, you know, not good for our community, not good in what she stood for, not good in any way, in the way she treated her family, from what we, you know, she was all over television. It was all really kind of sensationalist, but also she's not I'm sure a lot of people would disagree, but she wasn't a terribly nice trans person. And when that trans person is the most visible one that you had, although Laverne Cox was also up there as well and seems quite lovely, Caitlyn wasn't, and that's sort of what people latched onto. And any bad trans person they possibly could see, that was what all trans people were.
To talk about things which have riled people up particularly, and the thing that gets spoken about so much is trans people in sport.
I mean, Leah Thomas, who was, I think, one of the ones who started this big thing, she was a swimmer. She is a swimmer who won one race and beat lots of cis women, but then went on to, which obviously made front page of all the newspapers, you know, trans woman, really a man, steals medals from. She then went on to lose, I think, her next 23 races, but that didn't make the cover of any of the papers because obviously that wasn't interesting. There was also then obviously the big powerlifter, trans woman, who won, I think, one big competition and then went on to lose and lose and lose and lose. But again, that wasn't, so the messages that lodge in people's minds are these bigger, broader, taller trans women that are stealing all the medals. It's just not factually correct. You know, if you look at the Olympics, I think there've been 14 trans competitors since 2000 or something. I'm sort of making up statistics, but I know that this is sort of in the ballpark, and I think 2 of them have won medals. You know, it is the argument against trans people in sport, which obviously this doesn't affect trans men. It's all about trans women because of this perceived physical superiority, is just not true. It's just, you know, there are not these swathes of trans women competing. There are not swathes of trans women stealing medals. And unfortunately, it's, you know, when you see it with girls at college level, and again, you're talking about, I think, a handful of about 10 students that the trans sports ban has actually affected in the US. You know, 10 young trans girls who've been ostracized and left out. But it's, again, it's the headlines, it's the sensationalist headlines. It's just like when they put on the front of a newspaper, you know, kids being trans and given hormones, and then there's a picture of a toddler. You're like, well, you know that's not true. We all know that's not happening, just as we know that trans women are not robbing all the medals. But it doesn't really matter when you've got so much kind of momentum behind you and people are just lapping it up.
Part of what we do at the charity that I run is, and one of the things we're most known for, is a program called Misfits, which is a fitness wellness program that runs all over the country 2 or 3 times a week. We see 4,000 trans people a month use this service. And the reason that it was set up is that we got this information back from a load of community surveys that showed that trans people did not believe that health, fitness and wellness was a space that they were able to enter into, not only because the information that surrounds it is so binary and so confusing, like, you know, women should have this many calories, men should do this many press-ups, you know, none of it really makes any sense when you're a trans person. It doesn't really compute. And so and not only that, but also the fact that sport and fitness is inherently binary and also mostly masculine, which is very, very scary for both ends of the spectrum of the trans community. And I think what tends to happen when we enter into the sport conversation, which I'm welcomed into quite a lot because of my work, we have been partnered with Nike for the last 3 years. So I've been asked to do a lot of talks around sort of like fitness and sport, and specifically talking about trans stuff. I think we instantly go to Olympic level athletes. However, anyone who reaches the level of competing in that way has managed to dedicate their entire life, their full-time job is that sport. Can you name in your life how many athletes you've met for whom their life is a sport? It's just not realistic. We do make up this like tiny bit of the country, and of that part of the population, can you imagine how many of those people are able to make sport their job? It's just not happening. It is such an empty conversation to be having. And what we should be talking about within trans people entering into sport, look, there's never going to be an answer that suits everyone. There's never, in the same way talking about the trans kids debate, the same way the toilet debate, there's never ever going to be an answer reached that pleases both sides and we all agree on and then we move forward. It's just not going to happen. But what we do need to get to is a point where we go like, hey, guess what? We all share this horrible little scrap of land called Great Britain and we're just going to make the best of it. We deserve equal access to health. We deserve equal access to sport and well-being. And the benefits that you get as a byproduct of taking part in sport and fitness and wellness, i.e. the mental health benefits, the health, you know, the pressure that alleviates from the health system. We're partnered with the NHS. The amount of trans people that reach their surgery date after waiting, 10, 15 years to get to a surgery date, nearly 50% of those trans people are turned away because they're overweight. Their BMI is too high to have surgery. We need to move away from this like Olympic level sport conversation and start talking about like, let's open this up a little bit and let's get a bit more realistic. There's not that many of us and we're just looking to run around.
If we were to look at the wider LGBTQ community, you know, there's this huge anti-woke culture nowadays. Trump is an example of that, and the fact that he got voted in off the back of people being frustrated with woke culture. So I wonder if the sort of anti-transness of society at the moment, do you think that LGBTQ people have asked too much of people in terms of progressiveness too quickly? This has all happened quite radically over the past few years, and do you think that it's almost been quite a lot for people to process?
I think it's definitely a lot, especially from like a generation. Again, I come from a Bengali background. Like, you can't even like put that into words of like, I don't think there's like the words for it in my language to explain that. And some people are unshakable, especially if they've gone through a different generation's indoctrination. So I think so long as there is respect to like, I don't agree with or I don't understand, but I'll let you be, as that's the bottom line, that how everyone should think. I do think, and this kind of goes into like the whole J.K. Rowling thing. I think when she first started being problematic, my friend said that we pushed her too far into this, what she is today. Because she was at first, apparently she was making a few comments here and there, but then the queer community jumped on that, so we almost enabled this monster to come through.
What do you both think?
I kind of agree that I think, I think that whole situation could have been managed better. I fear that we are a community that has had so much knocks. We are primed to be attacked. We are primed to lash back out, to defend ourselves. And I think in doing so, we have tended to and can tend to make enemies where necessarily there wasn't a need to make those enemies. I think there are times and moments when we need to just sit back and breathe and maybe have a conversation. And of course, I don't think JK was ever going to sit down with one of us and have a conversation. But I think that there are other people that have maybe said the wrong thing or done the wrong thing, or, people are so worried about offending us. And I know that because when my wife and I give talks, people will say, I know our team really want to ask you questions, but, they're so worried about getting the terminology wrong, so worried because they have seen what happens to people when they step out of line. And I think, whether or not JK would have still been quite the enemy that she is now, we'll never know. But I think there is a real danger with the way that I think any community that has been hurt and maligned and beaten and is so damaged, I think if we can try and moderate our responses, I think that there is less likelihood that we will make really powerful enemies and potentially even like make a friend.
From my experience of working in this space and being around this community, I think that it is just a bloody pendulum. I think we went from no visibility to the most visibility, and now we're swinging backwards, and I'm just hoping that we land somewhere in the middle. Do I think that we went too extreme? Yes and no. There were things, and there are things that I look around at that are happening within our community, and I think, God, that puts me off. Like
Name it.
name them.
Name them.
Don't name them. Definitely
not name a thing. There's no people and no actions being named. But there are things that I look at and I think, God, I wouldn't even want to support that, But I think, like I say, we've gone from one extreme to the other, and I'm just praying that we land somewhere in the middle.
Because the ruling that happened was consulted by a small amount of people, if this was to be a Brexit, this sort of law went out to everybody in the country, where do we think the percentage would sit in terms of agreeing and disagreeing?
Can I just before anything else, the fact that there was this ruling, this all went on without any trans people involved is absolutely mind-boggling. So what they wanted, these women, was for trans, call it what you like, it's just re-establishing the definition of woman. What they really wanted was to attack the trans community and was to remove rights and protections from the trans community, in particular the trans female community. Can you imagine having any kind of court case where there were clearly two sides? It was, these women and all these trans women, realistically, even though it probably wasn't pitched like that and it probably wasn't held like that, but to have had this court case, this very, very important, life-changing court case, without a single trans person involved in the room, in consultation, at any point, and for this to then be announced without any, is ridiculous. Can
Quite
you imagine?
quickly, right?
I mean, the speed of
The
it is
decision
almost
process.
irrelevant. Imagine if they were making a ruling about gay male marriage and they did all this and, argued against it and argued that it was harmful to the kids that were, whatever, but there wasn't a single gay man in that entire process. Or if they argued about the rights of people with disabilities, but not a single disabled person was involved, or women, or people of colour, or it just wouldn't happen. It would never happen. And the fact that that happened, which is now, as it is a life altering, this will be for many trans people, life altering, and we didn't have a single bit of skin in that game. Or we did, but we weren't allowed to have the skin in the game, is horrific.
When you said it, it's kind of like a Brexit conversation. I think it would be like a 52-48 situation again. I really do, and
For or against?
I think against trans people.
Do you think so?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, I
really
think
do.
there will be a lot more, especially people on the fence already. I think they're like, oh, the law says, so that means it's right.
Yeah,
Because sorry, go on
No.
now.
I think it would be like another Brexit-sized conversation, and I think that in the same way that Brexit was fed by people that were benefiting by feeding misinformation, I think the exact same thing would happen. I think the headline generators of these horrible men in dresses are coming to brick your windows. I think that would be, I really, really think that we would end up in exactly the same position as we are. I think that the fear-mongering has worked, and that's what it's shown.
It's what has unfortunately happened, what will continue to happen, because we are such a small minority. We are the 0.4 or 0.5% of the global population. It's not the same as when Harvey Milk said in the 80s, I know you're scared of us, and I know Anita Bryant's got her big hatred machine going about gay men. If you look to your brother, you look to your postman, you look to your neighbour, you look to your friend, and you will see one of us and you will get to know us. And it's knowing us that humanises us, obviously. This is why
100%.
sharing our stories of humanity, not of trans, but of humanity, those are the things that are going to unite us. And those are the things that make people think, oh, but my neighbour's trans and she's so lovely, and my friend and my brother and my neighbour, this can't be the case for trans people because there are too few of us. So what we need to do is kind of get beyond that, because I think Dani's probably right. I think it would potentially at this point, if you've got the media shouting at you every single day, and some of it, I've got family members that read the paper and that flip past the anti-trans bit. So quite often, I'll go over to a relative and see the male sitting there, and I think, and they're all a bit older and a bit, and we know that they don't believe it, and they sort of, as I say, tear it out and throw it away. But if that is at you, not just from the right wing press, but from all the media, the Guardians and the Independents and it's everywhere. As I say, the cover of the Mail today, women still bravely fighting for their safe spaces.
Yeah.
If you're seeing that everywhere, how on earth could you possibly not feel that way? And unless you've met someone as delightful as Dani or Seana or even potentially me, you're obviously not going to ever understand that we are just people and that we're not scary. And unfortunately, we're a way away from having that happen.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely agreed. Yeah, I mean, look at the headlines following the judgment. Daily Mail's headline, trans women and men.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting when people say which of the big the red tops is trans friendly. None of them, sweetheart. They're all the same.
None of the broadsheets. None of them. None of them.
None of them.
We're doomed. We are.
Yeah.
Our PR, unfortunately, is not good.
Yeah.
And we just don't, our voices are not loud enough.
Talking about other people that aren't trans within LGBTQ, why should they give a fuck about what's happening right now?
Because you're next. That's why. Because we need you now to use your voice, use your platform. People think I've only got this many followers. I only work in accounts in bloody HSBC or whatever it is. We need all of you. We need you now because you will be next.
They're going down the alphabet.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I agree. I think, we all need to realise that the world at the moment has taken a terrifying swing to the right and to a place of intolerance and unkindness and a lack of acceptance. And that will start to affect anyone who is not a cisgender white man very, very soon. Because as we see, the Andrew Tates are rising in popularity, and there are a lot of very angry young men out there. And unfortunately, it's a lot of, men that run the world. And if they have decided that we are now not leaning into acceptance and kindness and inclusion, then that's what will happen. We will end up in a very, very scary world where we are all having our rights removed.
Can I ask you a strange question, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to?
Please.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, go on.
I've interviewed 36 gay men now on the podcast, and at the end of it, they always say that if they were born again, they would choose to be gay. And they all go, you know, when I was a teenager, the last thing I wanted to be was gay. If I could click my fingers, I wouldn't be gay anymore. But now, if I could choose my life again, I would be gay. If you could choose your life again, would you be born trans?
The things I've done today and hopefully will continue to do, I wouldn't be who I am. Like, I wouldn't be this brown person tackling X, Y, and Z. And the story that I have, the woman I've become, I've, like you said, fought for it, fought for my seat at the table. So no, I would still happily be born the same way. Like, I think there's so much beauty in being trans, and yeah, I wouldn't trade it.
Yeah, I'd be trans forever.
I think life would be a lot easier if I were not. And that's just, you know, I think it would have been easier. I could have had kids a lot more easily. I could have done a lot of things a lot more easily. And if I weren't trans, what would I be? Would I be a woman or would I be a man? So that's it. You know, I'm kind of
Oh, I didn't even think of that as an option.
well, yeah. I mean,
I think being a gay boy would be fun.
I think obviously I wouldn't be who I am, so it's a really hard question to ask. But having gone through what I've gone through in the last 10 years, and you know, even on in the cab on the way here, hearing that banks are already implementing this horrific ban, this when it's not even legislation, feels so heartbreaking and feels so worrying. And because at the moment, as I say, I'm feeling that worry for my wife. When things are good, I'm like, yeah, great. I'm very happy with who I am and what we've achieved and what we're doing. And, you know, I think it's a great community. At the moment, honestly, I think life would be a lot easier were I not trans. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I would choose not to be. It's just that I wish the world were a lot kinder to us.
We need to leave it there, but I just want to say thank you so much for talking about all of this. I know that some of the questions could have been slightly inappropriate or challenging. I would just hope that this is an opportunity to hear from three trans people that weren't involved in this ruling. I think that's such an important part of this, is to empathise with trans people, meet trans people, hear their stories and realise that they aren't just what you read in the paper. They are real people living real lives that ultimately just want to chill and get on with things.
Yeah.
It's not asking for much.
It is not.
Nailed it.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
babes.
Thank you.
All Out is an original podcast made by Gimme, a video and content production company based in East London. If you're a brand or company looking to make your own podcast or any digital content, we'd love to collaborate with you. You can email us at hello@gimmevideo.co.uk.